Well, thank you so much, Melissa. That was a great bunch of great case studies on innovative ways to look at simplifying all the different regulatory. In California, we've got a reputation as being a very heavy regulatory state, and it's really exciting to see all the different ways that people are innovating to meet those requirements and help reduce the cost of compliance. So really great panel, and really exciting to see all those innovative efforts. So next up, we have our last panel on Friday afternoon. But it's really an awesome, I think, panel, because it's looking at how we can take kind of the old ways of financing infrastructure and flip it up and look at whole new ways to approach it. Some like the really cool panel coming up, looking at technology and ways to do a lot of bottom-up financing of different types of infrastructure and some of the distributed infrastructure that we look at. And so we have a fabulous moderator in Michael Gardner, who has a wealth of experience working across managing engineering and technology, Silicon Valley companies, and global companies. So just a wealth of experience. And a few years ago, he got the bug to do a startup. And so he has a startup that's looking at ways to innovate the way that utilities finance projects. It's called Kayaks. It's a finance tech firm, or fintech for the lingo, and that uses data to enable new ways to finance water infrastructure of all types. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike for our last, but not least, panel for the 2-day summit. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Drew. And thank you all to all of you attendees that have stuck it out, basically. Drew, if we could have the first slide, please. So what we're going to be talking about today are some things at the cutting edge of using data to enable new finance models for financing distributed infrastructure. This could apply to any infrastructure, but we're particularly thinking about green infrastructure, and we'll be talking about some examples of that. We have an all-star panel. Each of us will be briefly introducing ourselves and our organizations at the beginning of our presentations, but I'll just say that with us we have Carolyn Cook with Water Now Alliance, Ed Harrington from the Water Now Alliance, and Ed Pinero from Ecometrics, basically. And we're trying to save as much time for questions and discussion at the end. So I'm going to get right on into it. But I wanted to also say, please, if you do have a question, use the QA button at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat. Put them into the QA. We will be keeping an eye on it. If we have time, my panelists might be able to take 1 or 2 questions at the end of their session. But in general, we're trying to wait all the questions until the end, basically. And we also have a few polls, and we can now move to the first poll, which is going to help us learn a little bit about you. So what best describes you and your role in your organization? Do you design projects? Do you help find funding for them? Are you part of the funding process and the supply chain of capital, or other, basically? And I think you all probably know how to vote, but if not, you could probably ask about that. Okay, maybe we can take a look at the results. Let's see. So looks like of the voters, looks like there's a good chunk of you that do design infrastructure, basically, and then a number of you are just do other things, but you're interested in the topic. Thanks much. That's great. And Drew, next slide, please. We can actually go to the next too, basically. Thank you. And even one more. Sorry. Thank you. So as Drew said, I'm Mike Gardner. I founded a fintech company. I'm not going to talk about it much, but what I'm going to be presenting is a case study of one of our customers that is using our cloud software as part of their strategy for financing a stormwater portfolio, and I'll be talking about that portfolio itself in just a minute. Our software is designed to enable multiple groups to be able to collaborate and to use data and information to be able to inform the finance processes, and also to track the return on investment in different dimensions from those investments. And let's go ahead into the case study. So next slide, please. I wanted to, at the beginning, just mention one thing, that there is a concept in capital circles. So this is with donors and with investors and so forth, called impact modeling or impact ROI. And historically, investors and donors were interested in the financial return from an investment, how much money would they make? But increasingly, they're actually interested not only in that, but also in impact. What is this project going to do for the environment? What is this project going to do in the social dimension? Will there be a disadvantaged community with better water supply or better sanitation? Will it create jobs? Things like that. And so the context for the Monterey portfolio is that there's increasing interest in being able to document these multi-benefits and document the multi-benefit ROI. And that is kind of central to their strategy. Next slide, please. And our client is a consortium of organizations which includes nonprofits and some local agencies in the Monterey Bay area. They've been working for 2 years on a master plan for the area, a stormwater master plan. That includes now 17 projects. The total financing need across that portfolio is $73.8 million. They're planning, as part of their strategy, that about $35 million of that will come from state funding, but all of that will require 100% matching. And so the trick for them is, how do they line up and secure, and what is the strategy to get that matching funding as well as get the state funding? And as I mentioned, they're using Akayax to help with that. Next slide, please. And I think this is, at the heart of it, is kind of the process that they're using for doing that. And I think this is probably the most important slide out of my slides, basically. So what they did at the beginning is they came up with a multi-benefit ROI model, basically, for all the different projects. And so in that, they quantified every project in terms of its benefit, in terms of nutrient reduction or other water quality benefits, in terms of freshwater production, what the social benefits are, and things like that. So they had developed this model, and they're now in the process of onboarding that model into Akayax, into our software. And at that point, the different formulas become algorithmically computed scores. And we have these icons that we call badges in our software. And so you can see the results of those computations as the badges. We also have other ways to integrate data. And so they're able to use data sets, some of them pretty interesting sets, so that the investors and the donors evaluating the projects can have context on the project, and so that over time they can use that data integration and use those data sets to track the actual delivered benefits. So it's not only about estimating the benefits in advance, it's also about being able to do the post-investment accounting, and even after the project is completed, to be able to do that accounting and do that reporting, basically. And that accountability and reporting is increasingly of interest in capital circles with donors and with investors. They've, by the way, and just to mention that one of the data sets they've integrated is the CCAMP data set, which is a pretty cool water quality data set showing many, many different dimensions of water quality. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this, but this is at a high level the multi-benefit model that they're using. As I had mentioned, they're tracking different measures of water quality, also water supply, flood management benefits, and so forth. And so across this, they end up having the multi-benefit model that they're integrating into our software. Next slide, please. And I had mentioned using data. So this is just an example of, if an investor or a donor is looking at one of the projects, the kinds of things that you can see. So you can see the project, and that's typical these days, that you have a GIS representation and you see the location of the project on the map. But what's less typical is that you have such granular data that you can associate with it, and so forth. And the dashboards that are very configurable and so forth. And they're just in the process of doing that. Next slide, please. And this is probably the second most important slide in my presentation, basically. And this is, so I've shown you kind of the process that they're using to you know, in terms of the data integration and so forth. But this is the process and the strategy that they're using in terms of being able to think at a much more strategic level about the funding. So rather than just say, hey, there's one project, you know, Jack, go get this funded, or Sally, go get this funded. Instead of that, they can think at the portfolio level. And the first part of that is being able to understand across the portfolio of projects how much capital is needed for the concept phases. Because as you all know, you have to get these projects through these different stages, get the concept developed, and then go into the actual proposal stage, get the preliminary engineering plan done, start permitting, get et cetera, get the, you know, a version of an environmental analysis done. Then you go into the actual construction. And so each phase requires capital. They're able now to think about that phasing of capital across all the different projects. Not that the projects are synchronous from a time perspective, different ones could happen at different times, but they're able to understand what types of capital relative to the stages of the different projects within the portfolio. And the second dimension of thinking strategically is being able to think about the types of capital that can come into play. As I mentioned, about half of this portfolio, they're targeting to be funded by the state. But they're also targeting about $4 million to come in from donors, primarily for the concept and proposal stages. That will allow them to curate the project definitions and get enough done that they become eligible for subsequent financing from different sources, whether that's from local, regional, public sources, or whether that's from additional donor sources, or whether that's even from commercial sources. There are two projects that are potentially commercially fundable in terms of being able to repay a loan and so forth. So they're able to think about the whole pie, if you will, of the whole portfolio, and think about it at just a different level, and then start fundraising at the portfolio level. Next slide, please. And that's it. So I'm going to hand it off now to Ed Pinero, who will be introducing himself. And Ed is going to give us some examples of what you can think of as higher resolution modeling, that what has been done in the Monterey Bay, basically. And also we'll be talking about financing projects with something called environmental credits, which are really cool.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me fine. Thanks for hanging in there at the end of the day on Friday. But if it's any consolation, I'm on the East Coast, so it's 6 p.m. here. So what I want to do quickly here is to introduce you to Ecometrics. And so I'm the president of Ecometrics LLC, and that's our company. And our primary, well, what we do is apply this methodology that we have developed for various types of projects. And what I'd like to do is introduce that to you in the context of making the connection between data, specifically water-related data, and the nexus of that discussion with applying kind of technology-related solutions to that. Can you go to the next slide, please? So fundamentally, Ecometrics is a methodology which is a calculation methodology. So we apply it to various kinds of projects that are all different types of projects. It was originally created by another organization called Restore the Earth Foundation, which is a nonprofit that started their work by restoring forested wetlands in Louisiana, in the Louisiana Gulf Coast area, as a result of trying to repair the forest devastation that occurred after Hurricane Katrina. For as much damage as Katrina did to people and to property, it was also one of the largest forest destruction disasters in America in history. In terms of how many acres of forest were destroyed up and down the lower Mississippi as a result of that. So anyway, Restore the Earth embarked on this mission to restore the forest along the lower Mississippi River Valley. In order to do that, they had to amass the proper funding that would allow them to invest in the restoration work. They created a financial model which was a mix of private and public sector funding. And the reason they were able to do this was that area contains close to $1 trillion worth of energy industry infrastructure. So there's many companies that have a vested interest in the stability of that area. So there was private sector potential private sector investors. And again, because of Katrina and the BP Deep Horizon oil disaster, the money that came from that, there was also a significant amount of public funding that would have been available to apply. The trick was making the business case for restoration. So why would you want to invest in this kind of restoration work if your business is not restoration? So they created Ecometrics to be able to calculate, to quantify and monetize the full suite of benefits that come from this kind of work in the environmental, social, and economic categories. And the way Ecometrics was designed was enabled to fully document, verify, and report this information in a way that is credible and usable for a variety of different reasons. We then decided after a few years that Ecometrics was something that could be used on other types of projects, and we were underutilizing it, so to speak, to restrict it only to the Restore the Earth projects. So we embarked on this mission to adapt Ecometrics to other applications. Can you go to the other next slide, please? So one of the things we can't do is go into a deep dive detail about Ecometrics. So I'll just kind of give you some high level components of it. First of all, the relevance to this discussion is Ecometrics uses data in order to be able to do its calculations. The data comes from many different sources, either available databases, direct site observation and data collection, interviews. There's a whole many different ways we get the information. Ecometrics also generates information. So after it gets these inputs, for example, how many acres of land, what kind of project is being done, is it a restoration project, is it a riparian buffer, is it agricultural best practices, whatever the application is, we collect information about that. We also need to collect information about the conversion parameters. So what's the average nitrogen and phosphorus retention of a particular type of land use in a given area? What are the concentrations of certain parameters in surface water and groundwater and so on? So we need to collect information in order to be able to run the calculations. The typical outputs we get from Ecometrics are quantification and valuation of ecosystem services. So for example, the restoration projects in Louisiana is replanting cypress trees to restore the land that has been washed away as a result of storms in general, but especially with Katrina. That restoration work, those planting of trees, has a variety of different benefits it brings to the area. Not only the carbon sequestration capacity, but also the storm surge attenuation capacity and the natural water quality improvement capacity of wetlands and forests. So there's many different ecosystem services that we need to be able to quantify and then put a dollar figure on it. So that's what Ecometrics does. It actually, in a nutshell, it runs those kind of calculations and it comes up with the full suite of benefits. Water quality and water related parameters are part of it, but we also look at carbon, biodiversity, community improvement, resilience, and a whole bunch of different other parameters. We use it for either forecasting. In other words, here's what we'd like to do at a particular place. What will the changes to the ecosystem and what will the changes to the community be as a result of that? And how does that translate into monetized benefits? Because these monetized benefits is what the investors need in order to make the business case. So if you're going to invest in restoration, you need to be able to say, what does that bring back to me in the community in terms of value? It's also evaluative, which means we can use it to monitor a project. So the restoration projects in Louisiana, for example, it's thousands and thousands of acres that are being planted over many, many years. So we constantly monitor and update our information, which is then used by our investors to make additional decisions on investment. Can you go to the next one, please? So one of the things that makes Ecometrics credible is, first of all, the credibility of the data that we get into the information, but also how we use that information to calculate values. And the way we've addressed that is by hardwiring into the methodology globally accepted protocols. And I'm not going to go into these in detail other than to say, when we talk about calculating social return on investment, social value, we use Social Value International's protocols. We use the American Carbon Registry protocols to calculate carbon sequestration and carbon offsets, and so on and so forth. So we build the validity of the tool by virtue of the quality of the data we use and the methodologies we use to process that information. Can you go to the next one, please? So this is just a kind of a representation of some of the kinds of outputs that we can do with this particular project, the Pointe-Noire project, which is a restoration project in Louisiana. We were able to figure out the carbon sequestration capacity, the water retention in the watershed capacity, and there's 51 outcomes that we were able to characterize, ranging from pollinator habitat improvement, nitrogen, phosphorus retention, soil erosion control, and so on and so forth. We can also sort those benefits by stakeholder, and the pie chart is just an example of all the different stakeholders that were affected by this project and what share of the total benefit of the project we were able to figure out. You also see that by virtue of doing this work, we can calculate this return on investment. So the investors look at this and say, well, for every dollar we put in, we're getting $14 worth of return on investment for this particular project. And that's how we use this methodology. Can you go to the next slide? In the minute or so I have left, just want to point out that, and again, connecting it to the nature of the discussion we're having today, we're working with Achaix to take the methodology and put it into the cloud and establish a more sophisticated platform so that it really enhances the ability to extract data, especially from existing data sources, and process the information that we get out of Ecometrics in a way that we could do more comprehensive analytics. So we're looking forward to the working with Achaix on this in order to be able to really enhance the tool. So with about 45 seconds to spare, Michael, I am done. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ed. Let's see. So we're in just one sec. We're going to go to Ed Harrington, but one really quick question for you, Ed, which is, if somebody wanted to sell, could you give them just some quick sense of who are typical buyers of credits? Like, say, like a project was able to do carbon sequestration, who might buy a credit, basically? Just as a quick question.
Yeah, typically the people that take the benefits are might be companies, especially the carbon offsets. We get corporate people investing in the restoration work, for example, in order to be able to get assigned the carbon offsets, and that's a value to them. So they're basically buying carbon offsets by investing in the restoration work. We also can calculate water quality improvements, and in some states like Louisiana, you can actually trade nutrient reduction as credit towards compliance offset of an existing permit. So there's value in that because it's cheaper to get the credit by doing natural green infrastructure restoration than it is by building hard infrastructure like a treatment plant or something like that.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so we're now going to go to Ed Harrington, and Ed is going to introduce himself. And Ed, are you okay running the poll, or do you want me to run that first, basically?
I'm just going to ask them to do it when it's time.
Okay, excellent. Well, over to you.
Great. So thanks very much. Fascinating work you were talking about there. And so the next part of this is, since this program is about solutions for water resiliency, to be able to get most of these solutions in practice, you need money. And so working with your finance professionals is a pretty important part of getting that money. And so my part of this is going to be talking from a financial professional point of view. First thing I wanted to do was get a sense of how you work with them right now. So could we pull the poll up? Wrong poll.
It should be poll 3. Sorry about that.
There you go. So how well do you know your finance director? Love to hear what this is so we can kind of figure out whether we're working closely together or who knows who's there. And let me know when you're getting enough responses to show the response. Okay, that's great. So a good number of you actually work closely with them, and another chunk of you don't know who they are, or you don't really work. So we'll work on both of those things. You can close the poll. That's great. Thanks so much. And go to the next slide. So a little background. I work with Water Now Alliance. Carolyn's going to be up next talking about that. But my other background and things I do, I was the controller for the city and county of San Francisco for a long time. Then I was in charge of the Public Utilities Commission in San Francisco, the Water Power Sewer Agency. I work with a lot of nonprofits. I was the president of the Government Finance Officers Association. I was the treasurer for Greenpeace International for the last 7 years. Work with a group called SPUR in San Francisco Bay Area, a good government think tank, and I teach at the University of San Francisco. Next slide. So, working effectively with your finance professionals. What do you want to accomplish? What do they need from you? What drives the people you're going to be working with? How can you help them to get the information and the money that you need? And then how can you bring some new ideas to the finance professionals? Next slide. So, you know the programs you're working on. We are working on the assumption that you're working with green, distributed, non-traditional. This is not just about pipes and treatment plant. This is a wide variety of doing things related to water and wastewater infrastructure. Next slide. So do you know what your finance professionals care about? They do want to help. We really do want to help people do what was supposed to happen, but we are typically not hydrologists. We are incredibly protective of ratepayers because we know we've got to go back to them year after year asking for rate increases. And so we want to make sure that they trust us. We manage budgets that are always oversubscribed. You know, if you've done the Stephen Covey 7 habits of a good per person, whatever, effective manager, it talks about coming from a place of abundance. No, budget people are always coming from a place of scarcity. We are always oversubscribed. We are always having to make choices. And we're always too busy. And some of us may not be as creative as you might be. And so you don't want to tell them that, but you can help them out a little bit. I'll give you some ways to do that. Next slide. So the first thing is show them real comparisons with clear benefits. So if you walk in and say, I had this great water conservation program, cool, love to hear about it. But if you walk in and say, I know that we're going to get this many more customers, I know we're having a drought, I know this new industry is coming into town, they're going to need this much water. Here's several ways to take care of it. You can go ahead and try to buy more water from our water wholesaler. We can do a ground recharge recovery system, recycled water. We can do water conservation programs. Here are the choices that we might have, and this is what the benefits are. And so by doing that, you're proving to them right off the bat that you care about the bigger picture, not just your program, but hopefully you can sell your program or your project as one that's most important. Next. And so what do you do to make that happen? Sure, you show the cost and you show the initial cost. Obviously, you should also show the life cycle cost because you should show what it really is going to take care of the thing you're talking about. And then you should show the benefits. Mike had a great slide a few slides ago about a wide variety of different benefits that you can show people. And so that is a nicer way of saying it than just, and you get this many acre feet out of it. Show the useful life. If you're talking about some newer kinds of technology or things that feel kind of new in terms of projects, your finance people may not be as familiar with those things as you are. And so they may think, oh, gee, if we do this, it only has a 1-year life, a 5-year life. When you know, and there's literature out there saying, this can be a benefit for 30 years, 50 years, show them that kind of information. Don't expect that they will necessarily just know it off the bat. Next. It's also important to show that projects can be scalable. So if you walk in and say, I have this groundwater recharge project, it's $40 million, kind of take it or leave it. You can't do much unless you give me all $40 million. But if you walk in and say, I have this water conservation program, it would really be good to spend $40 million, but if you give me 10, I can do this much. If you give me 20, I can do this much. That allows the finance person, when they're looking at their next 5 or 10-year capital program, to say, you know, that's great. What if I put in $10 million a year for 4 years? So that they know that they don't just say, it's not just a yes or no answer. There are choices they can make and choices to help you. And also show them that projects can be done quickly. You know, if you're doing a major project, by the time you finish environmental review, engineering, bidding, you're lucky to even start that project within 5 years. There's a lot of smaller projects that often are customer-related, customer-focused projects that you can get almost an immediate benefit from. So if they know they put money in this year and they're going to get a result this year and next year, that's incredibly important for finance folks and everybody else to know that. Next slide. So we've talked a bit about the information you need to give them to convince them it's the right thing to do. And then the next thing is, so then how do you actually do it? And what happens is when we're talking about these more innovative programs, we're often talking about projects that are on the customer side of the meter. Most finance people are very used to saying that, you know, I have to own something, I have to manage it, I have to know what's going on with this. And so unless you can tell me how I'm going to own and manage customer side of the meter kinds of things, that's really awkward for me. Are you telling me that a turf buyback program that buys somebody's lawn and makes it go away is an asset for the organization? That's a new concept for a lot of finance people. And so there's two ways that you can help them understand how to do that. One is what's called regulated operations accounting. It's an exception to normal accounting, but it is absolutely set up under accounting rules by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, GASB. And what it says is that if you are a regulated operation, and the definition of that is you can set your own rates or someone sets them. You can promise to set rates to pay back debt if you borrow it. You can go ahead and set rates that you can actually collect from your customers. And if you can answer yes to those things, when you spend the money, you create an asset. It is a regulatory asset. It can be depreciated, amortized the way you can normal fixed assets, but you don't need to own it. You don't need to manage it. You don't need to control it. You don't have all the liability that comes with those things. But in fact, you can borrow money to do it and you can put an asset on your books. Really, really incredibly simple. Sometimes there are some issues with that. Next slide. And so if you have issues, another option you can use is you can get some ownership in non-traditional ways, by contracts, by easements, by liens. There are different ways of doing things that establish some level of ownership and control. So for example, a turf buyback program, Los Angeles Water went ahead and did it under that regulatory asset point of view. They just went ahead and gave grants out to people. It worked out just fine. On the other hand, if you can't do that, like Las Vegas, they went out and did easements. And so they had people sign liens on their property that said, yes, in fact, you have an ownership interest in my front yard. And therefore you can have established that and you can issue debt and you can have an asset by your turf buyback program. So there's ways to do this that allow you to scale up and not just have whatever's left over from your rates from that current year to give out as small grants. Next slide. So with that, I'm hoping that you learned a little bit. I'm happy to answer questions later on, but I want to turn this over to Carolyn Koch from WaterNow, who can talk about how we also use some of this information to curate financial information. Thanks, Carolyn.
Great, thanks so much, Ed. So it's great to be here this afternoon. And as Ed and Mike mentioned, I'm Caroline Cook. I'm the Water Policy Director for WaterNow Alliance. You can go to the next slide. For those of you not familiar with WaterNow, we are a nonprofit network of local decision makers who are working to advance sustainable, affordable, and climate resilient water strategies across the One Water spectrum for their communities. Think mayors, city councilors, elected officials, and appointed officials. So you can go to the next slide. So WaterNow's work falls within a few different categories. We advocate at the state and federal level for to create policy pathways for these sustainable, affordable strategies. We provide innovative ideas, resources, and opportunities to our members, and we demonstrate success by working directly with communities to implement projects on the ground. So you can go to the next slide. So sustainable is kind of a catch-all term that I've already said a few times in 1 minute or so. So for WaterNow, we define sustainable as providing safe, healthy, and affordable water services for people while also preserving the integrity of those resources and the environment for future generations. So you can go to the next slide. Within this sustainability framework, as part of our Tap into Resilience initiative, and as Ed mentioned, we are working with cities to help them accelerate their investment and adoption of localized, distributed, on-site water strategies. So by distributed, we mean those water infrastructure strategies and solutions that are spread out across many properties in a community on both public and private land that are not owned by the utility, but do work in concert with traditional built infrastructure, but nonetheless are paid for by the utility. So these distributed strategies often include or are enhanced by data-based water technologies. You can go to the next slide. So these include data analytic programs like WaterSmart. Go to the next one. Consumer side of the meter leak detection devices. Next one example is smart irrigation controllers. And you also have the next slide, AMI. So next slide, thanks. So as my fellow panelists were talking about this afternoon, there are a number of ways to pay for these innovative distributed strategies. But as these water-based water technologies are catching on, in order to implement the programs at scale, as Ed mentioned, utilities will need to navigate also a set of finance, state level finance, and privacy laws and questions to really, again, be able to implement at scale. So some of these issues include, as I mentioned, state and local public finance laws, privacy laws, as well as state opt-out policies. But there are, however, ways that you can overcome these potential barriers. So we can go to the next slide. So for example, LA Department of Power and Water uses the regulated operations approach that Ed mentioned to debt finance their water conservation and green stormwater infrastructure rebate programs. And they do have about $140 million in regulated assets. But those accounting questions are not the only considerations for LA. Utilities in California might need to, for example, look to certain sections of the California Government Code that set policy, like Section 5900 that provides that it's a state policy that cities be able to debt finance public improvements, or Section 43602 that does in fact authorize cities to issue municipal bonds to pay for what are called municipal improvements. So rather in the interest of time this afternoon, going down all of those requirements, that's just a short window into what that legal analysis might look like. So you can go to the next slide. So to the privacy question, there's also some important lessons to be learned from the energy sector. So in Naperville, Illinois, for example, a group of citizens sued the public energy utility for the use of smart meters, alleging that the collection of the data was an unreasonable search under the Fourth Amendment. So the appellate court decision that came out in 2018, the court did find that the use of the AMI infrastructure constituted a search for purposes of the Fourth Amendment, but found that that search was reasonable and therefore constitutional for a few different reasons. First, there was no threat from the public utility for criminal prosecution based on that information. Using too much energy was not a crime in Illinois or in Naperville. Second, the public utility's interest in gathering the information, the energy use, served important public purposes, such as modernizing the grid, reducing peak demand, and otherwise encouraging efficiency. And third, the court found that because the search was reasonable, because the city had adopted an ordinance protecting disclosure of that data to third parties as well as law enforcement. So as an aside, the court also said that had the utility provided a genuine opportunity for customers to offer consent to that AMI infrastructure, then the Fourth Amendment issues might have been avoided altogether. And then turning specifically to California, water utilities might look to some examples on the energy side for guidance on how to collect, deploy, and protect community and individual information in SB 1476 that was adopted in 2009 that prevents the sale of consumer data for any purpose, and that data holders maintain certain security requirements. Another example might be AB 1274, enacted in 2013, that extends those privacy requirements to internet service providers, as well as other businesses that have control and access to that consumer information. So again, I won't go into every detail about the potential privacy laws in California. And as you heard on a prior panel, there are important reasons to have these standards. So you can go to the next slide. And to compile all of this information into one place and make it accessible and digestible to our members and our network, WaterNow is working on building a 50-state database of these public finance and privacy laws that will be part of our Tap into Resilience toolkit. We're in the beginning stages of developing the database, but we do hope to launch that sometime next year. So you can go to the next slide. And with that, yes, I will turn it back over to Mike.
Thank you, Carolyn. So we've got plenty of time for questions, but so far we don't have any questions. So if any of you in the audience do, go ahead, please, and put them into the Q&A window. Again, there's a button at the lower part of your Zoom screen that will let you access that. But I do have a couple things to kind of kick off the discussion with the team here. The first one is that if you know, assuming that there's somebody out there who's got a project and they're, you know, trying to get creative about how to get it funded, what do we have as suggestions about where to get started in terms of trying to bring data to bear upon these different issues, basically? I mean, do you start with the data? Do you start with your finance partner? Do you start, do you start somewhere else, basically? So where do we think is the right starting point if somebody wants to try to put some of these tips and strategies into play, within their organization? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
You know, my suggestion is part of it depends on your relationship. If you don't have a relationship with your finance people, it's not a good idea to start there by saying, I don't know much, but I want some money, right? Or I want to talk to you about this. If you have a great one and you're at lunch and you say, I have this idea, you think that would be saleable, that would be a great way to do it. But otherwise, I would go back and I would learn from what others have done. What's been successful in your agency? You know, do people rely a lot on data? Do they look at things in certain ways? How does your management, how does your commission or board look at things? Show me some things that have been successful, and then steal those and put your project into those successful ways of doing things. I would typically start with the data. I would typically start with, I want to be as much of an expert as possible so I can sell this.
Yeah, that's a great point. I loved your slide, Ed, by the way, about, the ROI and being able to walk in and say, here's what we can do. It's not about the project itself. It's here's how we're going to move the needle, essentially, and here's how we'll show it, basically. So being able to kind of line up the ducks that way in terms of what are the metrics we're going to be able to deliver, basically, that makes a lot of sense. Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Just going to add a little bit to that. And one of the things that we discovered, which really was one of the primary drivers behind the development of ecometrics as part of the restoration work in Louisiana was it was kind of an iterative process in that we knew what we had to do in terms of restoration, and we kind of knew who the potential funders were, but we needed to reach out to them to find out what would they need to know about this work that would make them be interested in providing funding. So that gave us some insight as to what kind of information data we had to provide, which in turn then helped identify even further funders and also be able to kind of pull the players together. So it was, to us, it was kind of an iterative situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have another question for you, Ed, but Carolyn, before I jump to that, Carolyn, any thoughts you want to add? It's no pressure if not, but just want to give you a chance if you do before I fire off another one.
I just appreciate, I really liked Ed Harrington's slides walking through, what to be prepared with when you're talking with your finance team. We've seen that process work in the past, so I will echo his comments.
Cool. So I have another question for Ed, but actually first we have a question from an attendee, an anonymous attendee, but thank you very much for the question. The question is, where do you think there might be an opportunity for microfinancing from the public? I might not be able to contribute $1 million, but I can donate 100, and so can 100,000 others. That's an interesting question, and there are some evolving crowdsourcing solutions in the space. The most interesting one from the perspective of this panel is an online platform called InfraShares, and what it is a crowdsourcing platform specifically for financing infrastructure. Now, it's not just water; it's all kinds of infrastructure, including clean energy and so forth, but water is definitely part of what they're trying to do. And they have both donor projects listed, and they have investor type projects listed where you might be able to get a return, and you're basically buying equity in that project, essentially, basically. So that's the most. There's a couple others basically that are kind of crowdsourced platforms, but the one specifically for distributed infrastructure, in my opinion, is InfraShares basically. So just to mention that.
I can add one slightly different example. I think of it's not a crowdsourcing platform, but Greater Cincinnati Waterworks uses, in order to help fund their lead service line replacement program, they take donations and community contributions through the acronym is HELP, and they've had great success in accessing community funding to pay for those, what Water Now calls distributed infrastructure, because it's not owned by the utility.
Cool, that's great. And we have another question too, which is, have any of these financing strategies been used or considered for distributed water supply augmentation projects like reuse, recycling, or desal projects? Do you see these strategies as different from the distributed infrastructure examples that have been discussed today? Well, let's see. Any panelists want to take a first cut at that? Basically, I have some thoughts on that, but let me see if anybody else has anything they want to offer first, basically. Well,
you had your hand raised. Did you want to answer that one, or
on the last one, actually? The microfinancing thing, just one other point on that. Some places now are doing microbonds. So I always think of large government organizations, not nonprofits or GoFundMe things for things you want to do. And so you'll find ads sometime on the radio that the state of California is issuing debt, but they're going to do a special issue for microfinancing, microbonds. And some local jurisdictions can be encouraged to do that too. They're a little bit more expensive, but you can go out and you can issue bonds for $1,000 each. They don't have to be major investors doing $100 million bond purchases at a time. There's ways that your organizations can bring in the community by issuing these micro bonds and having people feel like they're part of making a success out of some of the things you want to do. That's the last question, not this one. So go ahead, Mike.
No, that's a great point, Ed. Thank you. And actually, just to layer in on that, I don't think we won't have time to go into it in great detail, but there's a category of bond called a green bond. Most of you probably heard about it, but you may not know that much about it. But in 2018, the number one, there's a couple different standards, if you will, for green bonds. There are a couple different models for how to certify a project in terms of it being eligible for green bond finance. But in 2018, the leading the leading issuer of standards basically added a category specifically for natural infrastructure projects, and so it's entirely, you know, quote unquote legal, you know, basically, or entirely feasible now to actually go try to raise a green bond for an infrastructure project that could just be like a habitat restoration or a marshland restoration type project, or some a nature-based solution for stormwater, basically. So in addition to what Ed was saying about micro bonds, which is cool, you know, there's now, you know, green bonds that can cover that too. And maybe in the next year or two, we'll see the first green micro bond. That would be a really cool thing, actually, basically. And then turning to the question about have any of these been used for other types of projects, basically, I think that there have been, in the commercial world, there has been some, you know, there's been different versions of these things for a long time in terms of being able to kind of say, well, what are you going to give me? However, it's been a lot more purpose that, you know, what is the economic return of this? And show me that I'm not going to lose my money. Show me that I'm going to be able to get the interest rate that you're telling me on the loan and that you're not going to default, or that you're actually, you know, that your credit rating is what, you know, what it should be. I mean, you went through the credit rating process. You're now rated by Standard & Poor's, you know, if you're doing a muni finance or something like that. You know, so these techniques have been used in the commercial world for quite a while, but they're now being used to go to these other dimensions of benefits, basically. And I think that's what's unique about them. Some of them, I think, are emerging in some of the other areas. So if you look at what's happening with aquifer recharge in California and with the experiments with ASR recharge, and even with some of the things of Floodmore, I mean, I'm hoping, and this is, you know, my personal hope, maybe more than, you know, than a certainty that it's going to go there, but I'm hoping that, you know, that the GSAs will, as they think about their management plans for the groundwater basins, that they'll begin thinking, I think of necessity, they have to think a lot more about what is this project going to do in terms of improving the groundwater balance, basically, against the different withdrawals, you know, what do we have coming in? And so forth. And so I think that, you know, I think that in California with the groundwater situation, we're definitely going to be seeing these techniques brought to bear for a lot of different types of projects that pertain to that. And I think that we'll end up seeing that in other areas as well. But again, that's just kind of my prediction more than being able to point to, hey, look at that one or look at this one. But do any of the other panelists know of any concrete examples that we could point to? Okay, well, and then I have a question for Ed Pinero, basically, which is, Ed, with your, you know, with the projects that Ecometrics has been involved with, have you seen any, is there an example where there might be a different outcome that, you know, that developed because of using Ecometrics, but more particularly doing the modeling and being able to quantify the different benefits, developing, you know, perhaps some credits that could be sold, you know, as a new monetization avenue, and so forth. But, you know, is there anything on top of, you know, on the top of your mind where, you know, the techniques led to a different outcome, basically, than kind of what people had been working towards initially?
Yeah, I think that's so much a different outcome, but additional outcome. So particularly with the restoration project in Louisiana, and there was another one in Arkansas, it started mainly driven by the carbon sequestration outcome. But as the results came out of Ecometrics, which, because it looks at a whole suite of benefits anyway, as the funders examined the results, they were saying, well, wait a minute, we have all this other stuff, benefits that are monetized here that we could take advantage of. We know we have wetlands acreage that has been calculated. We have water quality improvements that can become tradable benefits. There's other issues about some agricultural benefits aspects to it. So what we realize is that people as they became aware of these other outcomes that were quantified and monetized, they started looking for business opportunities for those. And there's certain, except for certain cases, you're allowed to stack these benefits. So in other words, you could take multiple benefits from a single restoration project in a single area. So the Louisiana example, we have investors who are taking the carbon offsets and using those for carbon offset banking, and they're taking the nitrogen phosphorus reduction in the surface water quality to trade those credits on the water quality trading market.
Pretty cool. 2 for 1. Pretty cool. So, Carolyn's presentation was getting at some of the issues with governance of data and making sure that, that what you're doing in terms of data collection is legal and you're using best practices in terms of the governance on the data. And Ed Harrington's presentation was essentially talking about the culture of collaboration between finance and the project developers and the project groups and so forth. I think if we turn to data itself, though, do we have any suggestions about the culture of data? Because I think in a lot of organizations, they may not be very mature about collecting data. They may not have, a very large IT staff. They may not have much history about collecting data. They may work with data in various ways, so they may be quite familiar with using a data set that maybe the USGS has, or maybe some other scientists have compiled. But their organization may not have a culture of data per se. So do we have any suggestions or tips on how organizations can begin to tackle that cultural problem among many other cultural challenges in water today, basically? But that particular one about getting kind of a culture of data established. Any thoughts on that, about where people could begin with that?
Well, I am by no means a data expert, but an important thing that we talk about a lot is the need to establish metrics early on when you're designing and developing projects. Through our Project Accelerator, we work on that with communities a lot, so that you are setting yourself up for success in collecting the information that's needed to feed into all the models that ACAIX and Ecometrics are talking about. Because if you're not collecting it in the first place in a standardized way, then you won't be able to make the case. So that's something that we think about a lot, of establishing objective, clear, measurable metrics.
I think that's a really important point, Carolyn. And in fact, in my experience, not only in water, but in other industries, by starting with the metrics, you end up being able to then do a kind of gap analysis on the data. So if you know what you're trying to accomplish, and you say, look, we want to be able to use this metric and show here's today and here's the future, but we actually don't know what today looks like, basically, let alone what the future looks like. Or we have some sense of what today is, but we don't have a collection process in place to be able to know what it'll be like in the future. So we've been given, we've been given a data set or data representing the baseline, but we're going to have to put in place. But by identifying the metrics and how you want to move the needle and the KPIs, the key performance indicators and so forth on that can lead then to this a gap analysis on the data. Now that's maybe a little bit more processed in culture, but I think it's also part of how teams have to be able to think about data in terms of their, how they make these things kind of innate in terms of their instincts about that. Basically, they have to be aware of, well, what data do we have, what data don't we have, and then in particular, when we go to our finance people and try to show them, hey, we know what's going on. Here's the ROI that we're trying to get at. Basically, that they're able to think in those terms, basically, and it's a culture. It's a cultural thing, basically. We have about 5 minutes left. We have some other questions, but I just wanted to do one last call in case there's anybody else in the audience that looks like there's one open one. Sorry. Thanks for this question. And if anybody has any others, this is the kind of last call on questions. But we have one. Can you speak on how to get ahead of public perception when proposing projects for funding? I mean, this isn't just data, although to me, data is part of it, but I think this is a really important question. If you haven't built consensus to some degree and public support, and if you haven't created a communications plan in some sense, you need to do that. There's no doubt about that, I think, basically. But data can be a really important part of that, do the panelists have any thoughts about how people can use data for that in terms of building public perception and building public support?
Mike, it's interesting. The question is, how can you get ahead of public perception? And I think a lot of public agencies are catching up to public perception. It's not about us getting ahead of them. They're already ahead of us. And so part of it is, it's not just one public. So you have people that are in the environmental community who may be quite ahead of you. And the trick there is to galvanize their interest and their energy and use that in your organization to make a difference there. Then you have other people who might just very, very rate sensitive, and that's all they care about. And so making sure that you can have the data that says, look, at so-and-so did this and their rates went up less than our rates did, or this is the kind of return they got, in a really, really easy to understand way that you can put into your board packets and or put into a newspaper article if you have a friendly newspaper. But those are for the rate sensitive folks. But in many ways, we have so many people, especially in California, who just know that you need to use natural resources to make things happen. And they're waiting for us to come and give them ways to do it.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I really think you're right, Ed, that, it's not even just getting ahead, it's catching up, basically. And in some cases, maybe having to turn public perception around or do some education, basically, and so forth. Yeah, it's interesting. And the whole ratepayer thing is particularly interesting because it's such a challenge, basically, to, nobody wants to pay more, basically, even when we should, basically. It's a funny thing.
In San Francisco, I was able to go out and get a 5-year rate increase at one run through our board of supervisors for an 80% rate increase that would take 5 years to do. And we had no one come and speak against it because we had built that level of trust and we had built something that people wanted to see happen. That's
an amazing success story. That's an amazing one for sure. I knew about that actually. But yeah, that's a great point, in terms of like a standard that people could aspire to, basically, and stuff, for sure. Let's see. Any last questions? This is the real last call, basically. Any last questions? Well, I have one. I guess this is not just for the panelists, but also for the audience. But it's Friday, so anyone have any happy hour plans for the end of the Friday, basically? So in all seriousness, I just want to thank the panelists for the contributions. It was great. Thank you very much. I think we got through a lot of material, and I think clearly the audience was resonating with it. So just want to say thank you all for your efforts and for your time, basically, in preparing for this. And to the audience, thank you for staying so long. It's the end of the I know we were last, and we were keeping you from whatever happy hour or other plans you had for the afternoon and evening, but thank you for staying with us. And now over to you, Drew.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mike. Just wanted to thank everyone. It was a wonderful panel. It's great to see all these innovative ways of thinking about financing projects and what even a project is with a lot of the distributed infrastructure. So what a wonderful close to a wonderful 2 days. I just wanted to pop up the slides real quick and just do one final thank to all of our wonderful sponsors that helped make this whole event possible, starting with Metropolitan and Molten Miguel Water District as the platinum sponsors of the event, Aquametric and BioLargo, Ratio, Synergy is our gold sponsors, and silver at Best Krieger and Flume, and then bronze sponsors Geosyntec, Mazarine Ventures, PFM, and RDN. So really thankful for all of them for helping to provide the resources to put on this great 2-day event. And so really, bottom of our hearts, thank you for supporting this event. And I know all the event organizers are really thankful for that support to help make this happen. Also want to thank all the organizers. If we go to the last slide, we had a wonderful team behind the scenes to make this all happen. It was a great 2 days, and it took a village to make it all happen, from the California Data Collaborative staff, the team at Molten Miguel, and the Sustain SoCal staff, Alan and Scott as the has a great team to help put this whole event together. With the Governor's Resilience Portfolio just released a few weeks ago, one of the top priorities in it was water data, and it's no surprise given how much it touches across different issues, from agriculture to surface water issues, environmental issues, financing, and really it touches every aspect of water, and it really helps to innovate and look at water in a whole new mindset. And so really, I just wanted to leave the audience with that there's all these different aspects that are, and all these different projects that are innovating across the state. It's great to see so much diversity and perspectives, and that's one of the great pieces of this event every year, is having great distribution across technology companies, water utilities, state regulators, even federal representatives, NGO and environmental groups, academics, all coming together to talk about these ideas. And it really helps to bring everyone together to think about how we can innovate, how we can keep looking at technology to help support the future of water management. It's been a great 2 days. I also want to leave you thinking this is the end of the conversation. We're always looking at doing new events. Hopefully next year for the events, we can do them in person. But one of the things we've talked about is potentially having a monthly webinar. So please reach out. Let us know any content ideas that you have. All of the organizers would love to hear it. We want to maintain this connectivity. Check out the Slack channel. We want to hear from you. So really want to, and also just lastly, obviously if you've seen the recordings, we've made notes of it, but we are going to look to post the whole session in case you missed a piece of it here or there. We're going to make the whole 2 days available in some way. So look for that email and announcements for the event. So with that, I don't want to stand between the audience and happy hour and your weekend plans. So thanks so much for everyone for attending, and hope to see you at our future events, and hope to see you next year at the Water Solutions and Data Collaborative. So thanks so much.
And thank you, Drew. And Scott for leading everything. Take it easy, guys.